When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from the fear of being caught, but from the dread that he'd come across the messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I tried to snatch the phone out of his hands, but he quickly pulled it back and continued reading. I watched his face as it changed, reading line by line, and I could feel my life falling apart in those few seconds. Yes, he was about to discover the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he turned the page, and I knew right at that moment, he'd reached the one message that would destroy my life. The one that would either explain everything and seal my fate, or complicate things even further. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I watched as his face turned pale when he read the sender's name. My husband froze. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I was nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from 2 meters away. This was exactly what I had feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the mistake that changed everything forever, and now I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all really happened. Before I share the secret I've been trying to hide for so long, leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and answer this question. Have you ever had a secret you tried to keep hidden with all your might, only to realize in the end it was impossible to hide? The silence of the house seemed too loud as I sat in the living room, waiting for the phone to buzz again. The lights were dimmed, the hum of the refrigerator in the background barely audible over the storm outside. My husband had left for his business trip earlier that morning, leaving me alone for the next few days. Alone with my thoughts, alone with the growing weight in my chest. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief when he left, but that relief was mixed with guilt, a confusing feeling that seemed to permeate every corner of my mind. My name is Kate. I've been married for over 20 years, and by all appearances, my life should be perfect. I have a beautiful home, a successful husband, and a life that many would envy. But that's not the whole story. No one really knows what goes on behind closed doors. No one knows the cracks that run through the foundation of my marriage, the unspoken distance that had grown between me and my husband over the years. I hadn't always felt this way. There was a time when we were inseparable, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. I used to feel his love every time we touched, every time he looked at me. But over time, things changed. The touch of his hand, once so warm and reassuring, had become something I barely noticed. The long conversations we used to have before bed were replaced with silence. Our intimacy became a mere routine, something expected, not cherished. I found myself yearning for something I couldn't quite define. It wasn't necessarily physical, at least, not at first. It was something deeper, something that I had tried to ignore for years. I wanted connection, affection, something to remind me of the person I had once been. But that person seemed to be slipping further away with each passing day, buried under the monotony of everyday life. The storm outside had been raging for hours, the wind howling as it slammed against the windows. The flickering of the lights seemed to mirror my own unsettled thoughts. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I didn't pick it up. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. That's when I heard a knock at the door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitantly, I stood up, walked toward the door, and peered through the peephole. It was him. Ethan. My stepson. My pulse quickened. I hadn't seen him in weeks, and yet, his presence now seemed to stir something inside me. He wasn't a stranger to me, he had lived with us for years, but there was something different about him now. Maybe it was the way he had grown into his adulthood, or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen him in such a long time that made my heart race the moment I saw him standing on the other side of the door. I opened the door, my breath catching in my throat. "Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, a casual smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know it's a bad time with the storm and all, but I thought I'd check in. I figured you'd be alone." I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "It's fine. Just the weather's been a bit much." I gestured toward the living room. "Come in. You must be freezing out there." He shrugged off his jacket and followed me into the house. We didn't say much at first, just exchanged pleasantries about the weather, his work, and how the storm was making everything feel more isolated than usual. The conversation was polite, but there was an undercurrent, a tension I couldn't ignore. I could feel it, like a thread pulling at the edges of my composure, threatening to unravel everything. We sat in silence for a moment, the wind howling outside the window. I couldn't help but notice how different he seemed now. He was no longer the shy young man I remembered, he had become someone else entirely, someone who made my pulse race whenever our eyes met. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost too low, and I caught myself leaning in a little closer to hear him better. "Yes, I'm fine," I said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just a bit tired." He nodded but didn't look convinced. "You don't have to pretend, Kate. I can see it in your eyes." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You've been distant lately. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's like you're not really here anymore. You're somewhere else." His words stung more than I expected. He was right. I had been distant, not just from him, but from everyone. It wasn't something I had consciously done, it was more like a slow drift, a gradual separation from the things that once brought me joy. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The sudden darkness enveloped us, making the space feel even smaller, more intimate. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, all of it disappeared, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. "It's just the storm," I said, my voice sounding thin in the dark. "The power will be back on soon." But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something unspoken, something that neither of us could ignore. Ethan shifted in his seat, his body subtly moving closer to mine. I could feel the heat from his body, and for a brief moment, I found myself holding my breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. But in the darkness, with the storm howling outside and the power gone, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. And that feeling scared me more than anything else. The storm outside was growing louder, as if the world itself was trying to drown out the silence between us. The flickering of the lights seemed to exaggerate the tension, casting long, strange shadows across the room. I could feel the air thick with unspoken words, an invisible weight pressing down on both of us. I sat there, motionless, unsure of what to do. The darkness around us was consuming. The storm's fury outside had rendered the world beyond those four walls irrelevant. It was just me and him now, Ethan. My mind raced, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was my stepson, for God's sake. But here we were, in this strange moment, with nothing but the storm between us. I could hear his breath, steady, almost controlled, but something in the air had shifted. The way his eyes lingered on me, the way his body seemed to inch closer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. I felt everything. The pressure of the silence, the inexplicable pull between us. I wanted to look away, to distance myself, but I couldn't. It was as if some force had tethered me to the spot, to him. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, trying to push the thoughts out of my mind. I knew this was wrong. I knew I had to stop this before it went any further. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to move. Ethan broke the silence, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Kate, are you all right?" I blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sounding more shaky than I intended. His gaze didn't leave me, his eyes searching mine as though trying to read something that wasn't visible on the surface. "I know you've been distant lately. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. You don't seem like yourself." I felt a flicker of guilt, sharp and sudden. He was right. I had been distant. More distant than I should have been. I had retreated into myself, into a space where nothing felt real, where everything seemed to blur together. I wanted to explain it to him, to tell him that it wasn't him, it was me, that I had been struggling with feelings I couldn't understand. But how could I say that? How could I admit that I felt a connection to him, a pull that I couldn't deny? That admitting it would be crossing a line we couldn't come back from? "I'm fine," I said, the words tasting false on my tongue. "I'm just tired." Ethan nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. There was a pause, a pregnant silence, and then he moved slightly closer. The proximity sent a strange shiver down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore, the way he was sitting so near, the way his presence filled the space between us, the warmth radiating from his body, as though it were something tangible. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The air in the room seemed thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I was acutely aware of every small movement, the way his leg brushed mine, the way his fingers tightened on the armrest of the chair. Every motion felt amplified, as though it were happening in slow motion. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, this time his voice softer, almost coaxing. I glanced at him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my pulse quicken. Something vulnerable, yet there was a quiet confidence in his eyes that made my stomach twist. He wasn't just my stepson anymore, he had become someone else, someone I wasn't sure I knew how to handle. "I'm fine," I repeated, but this time, the words felt even more hollow. I couldn't lie to him. And yet, I couldn't tell him the truth either. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous. It was a mess of emotions I couldn't untangle, and I was terrified that if I tried, I would lose everything I had built, my family, my sense of self, everything. The storm outside roared louder, the wind rattling the windows, the house creaking as if it were about to give way. It felt like the world itself was collapsing around us, mirroring the chaos inside me. The storm had taken away the light, and now, it felt as if it had taken away the barriers I had so carefully built over the years. We were left in the dark, and for a moment, it seemed as though nothing mattered anymore. Nothing except the way our breaths sounded in the silence, the way our hearts seemed to beat in sync. Ethan reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, a fleeting touch, but it felt like a spark in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up and walked out of the room. But instead, I stayed still, rooted to the spot, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't explain. His touch lingered, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was an innocent touch, or so it seemed, but in that moment, it felt like the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. I couldn't explain why, but I was drawn to him in a way that scared me. I wanted to pull away, to scream at myself for even considering this, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by my own desires, my own confusion. "Kate," he whispered, his voice low and soft. "You don't have to hide from me. You don't have to be alone." Those words hit me harder than anything else. He had no idea how much those words resonated with me, how desperately I had been craving someone to say them. I had been so alone, trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark, in a life that felt empty. I had been craving connection, craving someone who could see me for who I really was. And now, here he was, offering me that connection. But at what cost? I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to stop this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared at him, caught in the pull of his gaze, feeling like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't control. Then, in the midst of the silence, it happened. Without thinking, without really understanding what I was doing, I leaned forward slightly. My lips brushed against his, a soft, tentative kiss that lasted only a second but felt like a lifetime. We kissed. The room spun, and for a brief moment, everything around me disappeared. It was just him and me, caught in the darkness, in the storm, in a world where nothing made sense anymore. I pulled back quickly, my heart racing. What had I just done? What had we just done? But there was no turning back now. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, it felt like the calm before something much worse. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to find my way back. The storm continued to rage outside, the sound of the wind howling against the walls, the occasional crack of thunder rattling the windows. It was as though the world had been swallowed up in this endless, chaotic noise. And yet, here I was, caught in the most deafening silence of all, the silence between me and Ethan. The kiss lingered between us, a tangible thing that I could still feel on my lips, a sensation that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I leaned back in my seat, trying to put some space between us, but it was hard to breathe in the thick atmosphere that hung in the room. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet there was also a strange sense of relief. Relief that something had finally happened, that the tension had been broken, even if it was in the most unexpected and dangerous way. Ethan shifted in his seat, his eyes still on me, but there was something different in his gaze now. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, something unspoken that hung in the air between us. He wasn't afraid to look at me, and in a strange way that only made things harder. His eyes seemed to see right through me, to the parts of myself I'd been hiding, the parts one didn't want anyone to see. "Kate," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Are you okay?" I didn't mean to. I raised my hand, cutting him off before he could finish. I knew what he was going to say, but I didn't want to hear it. "No," I said, shaking my head, trying to steady myself. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And now I don't know what to do." The words were out before I could stop them, and once they were said, there was no taking them back. My chest tightened, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had been holding everything inside for so long, but now it was all spilling out, everything I had been trying to suppress. The guilt, the confusion, the fear. Ethan didn't speak right away. Instead, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if he understood the gravity of what had just happened, or if he was still processing it. But I knew, deep down, that we couldn't just pretend this hadn't occurred. The kiss wasn't just a mistake, it was something that changed everything. It was a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. I stood up, pacing the small space of the living room. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. Every time I tried to push the thoughts away, they came rushing back, faster and stronger. I had been married for 20 years. How had I let it come to this? How had I allowed myself to feel something for Ethan? This was wrong, so wrong on so many levels, but the more I tried to deny it, the more I felt drawn to him. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I don't know how to fix this." Ethan stood up, his presence behind me suddenly overwhelming. "You don't have to fix anything, Kate," he said gently, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "I don't want to make things harder for you. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I turned to face him, my chest tightening with emotion. "I'm not okay," I said, my voice cracking. "I haven't been okay for a long time." The truth hung between us like a heavy weight, suffocating me. I had been lying to myself for so long, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I had been craving something, anything, beyond the emptiness that had filled my life for years. And now, standing here with Ethan, I realized that I had let myself fall into something I couldn't control, something I wasn't prepared for. "You don't understand," I said, taking a step back. This is wrong. You're my stepson. I'm married. I can't just let this happen. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." Ethan didn't move. He stood still, watching me, his expression softening, but there was still that same intensity in his gaze. "I don't want to pretend," he said quietly. "I don't want you to be alone anymore. I know things have been hard for you, Kate. I can see it. I've seen the way you look at me sometimes, the way you pull away. I just wanted to be there for you." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had tried so hard to hide my feelings, to keep everything buried, but he had seen through me. Ethan had always been perceptive, but I never imagined he would notice how much I had been struggling. How much I had been craving something, someone, to fill the void. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This feeling. I've never felt this way before." Ethan took a step closer, but I quickly raised my hand, holding him off. "No, Ethan. Don't. We can't do this." He stopped, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Kate. I just want you to know that I'm here. I've always been here." The sincerity in his voice made it even harder to pull away. But I had to. I had to stop this before it went any further. I couldn't let myself be consumed by this. I had a family. A husband. I had responsibilities, commitments. I couldn't throw all of that away for a momentary weakness. But in the silence of the room, I couldn't ignore the fact that I was torn. Torn between what I knew was right and what my heart was telling me. "Please, Ethan," I said, my voice shaking. "I need you to leave. I can't do this. Not now. Not ever." He looked at me, his face a mixture of confusion and understanding. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." And then, as quietly as he had come, he turned and left the room, disappearing into the storm outside. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had told him to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just lost something important. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to get it back. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the silence was deafening. The night stretched on, and the storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil inside me. My house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a cage. The darkness around me mirrored the chaos in my mind. I had asked Ethan to leave, but the weight of my own feelings refused to follow him out the door. He was gone, but I couldn't escape what had happened, what I had allowed to happen. I stood by the window, staring out into the rain-soaked night, trying to clear my mind. The streetlights outside barely cut through the heavy downpour, their weak glow barely visible through the mist. Everything seemed so distant, so far away. The world felt out of reach, as though I were living in a dream, suspended in time. I hadn't expected the kiss to happen. I hadn't expected it to feel like it did. When our lips met, it had been brief, fleeting, but it had also been a moment of truth, one that I couldn't ignore. It was like a floodgate opening, and everything I had been hiding, everything I had been suppressing, came rushing to the surface. I couldn't deny the attraction anymore, couldn't push it down the way I had tried to before. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological. Ethan was no longer just my stepson. He was someone else, someone I couldn't explain. But I had to stop this. I couldn't let myself fall any deeper into this mess. I had a family. A life that I had built. I couldn't destroy everything for a fleeting moment of desire, no matter how intense it felt. I walked away from the window, my footsteps heavy on the floorboards. The house felt eerily quiet now. The storm outside had drowned out all the noise, but the silence inside was suffocating. I needed to think. I needed to get a grip on myself. I couldn't let this moment define me. I walked into the kitchen, trying to distract myself. I started making tea, the familiar motions of boiling water, stirring the leaves, a small comfort in the chaos. I needed something to ground me, something to remind me that I could still control my life. But as the water heated, I found myself lost in thought again. Ethan's face, his eyes, his touch, they were all still there, haunting me. The kettle whistled, breaking my reverie. I poured the steaming water into the cup, the warmth of the liquid doing little to soothe the coldness in my chest. I sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from me, where Ethan had been sitting just hours ago. I wondered where he had gone, what he was doing now. Was he thinking about what had happened? Was he as confused as I was? I didn't know. I didn't know what he was feeling, but I knew what I was feeling. Conflicted. Torn between guilt and longing, between the life I had built and the pull of something forbidden. I couldn't ignore it, but I couldn't embrace it either. I didn't know what the consequences would be, but I knew they would be far-reaching. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. What did I want? What was I looking for? I had never stopped to ask myself those questions before. All these years, I had been so focused on keeping up appearances, on playing the role of the perfect wife, the perfect stepmother. But now, in the aftermath of what had happened, I realized how much I had neglected myself. How much I had neglected my own needs. The knock at the door broke through my thoughts again. My heart skipped a beat. Who could that be? I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I approached the door cautiously, my hand hesitating on the doorknob. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew it wasn't Ethan. Not again. I opened the door, and to my surprise, it was my husband. He stood there, drenched from the rain, his suit clinging to him as he looked at me with a mixture of concern and surprise. "Kate," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I wasn't expecting to be back so soon. The storm delayed my flight." I stepped aside, letting him in, the weight of his presence suddenly making everything feel more real. "You're home early," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out thinner than I intended. "Yeah, the weather's a mess. But I'm glad to be back." He shook the rain from his coat and placed it on the hook by the door, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for something. "Everything okay here?" "It's so quiet, too quiet." I nodded, my throat tight. "It's just the storm. It's been a long day." He gave me a long look, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure? You seem a little off. You haven't been yourself lately." I stiffened, the truth of his words hitting me harder than I expected. He was right. I hadn't been myself. But how could I explain that to him? How could I admit that I was lost in a sea of emotions I couldn't understand, torn between my duty to him and the overwhelming pull of something I shouldn't want? "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Really?" He didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, his eyes softening. "You don't have to pretend with me, Kate. I know when something's wrong. We've been together long enough for me to tell when you're distant." I froze, his words cutting deeper than I expected. He had always known me better than anyone else, but it felt like he was seeing through me now, past the mask I had put on. I couldn't hide from him anymore. "I'm just tired," I whispered, my voice breaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. He reached out, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll work through it together." I nodded, my heart aching with guilt. He was here, right in front of me, and yet, something inside me was pulling me away from him. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like I didn't belong in this picture anymore. As we stood there in the hallway, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging between us, I couldn't help but wonder, could I keep pretending? Could I keep living this lie, or had the storm outside, both the one in the sky and the one in my heart, finally broken everything open? I didn't have the answers. I wasn't sure I ever would. But as my husband pulled me into his arms, I realized that whatever path I chose, I couldn't go back. The past had been irrevocably shattered. The future, though uncertain, was something I would have to face, no matter how terrifying it might be. The days after Ethan left felt like they were suspended in time. The house seemed emptier than usual, the air thicker, as though it had absorbed the tension that had flooded through it. The storm outside had cleared, but the storm inside me raged on, relentless and unforgiving. It wasn't just the memory of what had happened between Ethan and me, it was everything else that had been building up over the years. The silence between my husband and me. The distance. The unspoken words that had never been said, the emotions that had never been shared. I tried to convince myself that everything would return to normal. That I would forget about the moment with Ethan, that it would fade away like a bad dream. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the stronger it became. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a crack in the foundation of everything I had known. And once something breaks, it's hard to put it back together, no matter how much you try. My husband was back, but the house still felt hollow. He hadn't noticed anything, he never did. He was too focused on his work, too preoccupied with his business trips and the things that mattered to him. We went through the motions, like we always did. We talked about trivial things, the weather, the news, but never about what had happened. Never about the way things had changed between us. The nights were the hardest. When I closed my eyes, all I could see was Ethan's face, his touch, the way he looked at me. It haunted me, followed me into my dreams, making it impossible to escape. And even when I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in me. That I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of tea in front of me. The steam curled up in delicate tendrils, rising into the air before disappearing into the stillness of the room. I had been sitting here for what felt like hours, my thoughts a swirling mess of confusion, guilt, and fear. I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of this, someone who wouldn't judge me. But I didn't have anyone. I had shut everyone out, built walls around myself so high that I couldn't even see over them anymore. The sound of the front door opening startled me, snapping me out of my thoughts. My husband walked in, carrying a briefcase, his tie loosened around his neck. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than usual. "Kate," he said, his voice tired but warm. "I'm home." I forced a smile, though it felt more like a mask than anything genuine. "Welcome back," I said, standing up from the table. "How was your trip?" "Long," he replied with a weary sigh. "I'm glad to be back." "Are you okay? You've been awfully quiet lately." I nodded quickly, brushing off the question. "Just tired." "It's been a long week." He raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced, but said nothing else. "Well, I'm starving. I'll make us some dinner. How about that?" "Sounds good," I said, my voice sounding emptier than I intended. I watched as he moved around the kitchen, the familiarity of his actions both comforting and suffocating at the same time. He was here, physically, but he was still so distant. So lost in his own world that he didn't see how much I was struggling, how much I was falling apart. As he hummed softly to himself, preparing dinner, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had no idea what I was going through. No idea how I was torn between the life I had with him and the temptation that had come in the form of Ethan. How could I ever explain it to him? How could I ever make him understand? I tried to focus on the dinner preparations, tried to bury the thoughts of Ethan in the back of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I looked at my husband, all I could think about was what had happened, what I had allowed to happen. It was like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, unable to step back, unable to go forward. We ate dinner in silence, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound filling the air. The words we didn't say weighed heavily between us, suffocating any attempt at conversation. It felt like we were strangers, living in the same house but worlds apart. I hated it, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know where to start. Later that night, after we finished cleaning up, my husband suggested we watch a movie. It was something we used to do often when the kids were younger, a way to unwind after a long day. But tonight, I couldn't focus on the screen. I couldn't focus on anything except the way my mind kept drifting back to Ethan, to the kiss, to the moment I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I excused myself, telling him I was feeling a little under the weather. He seemed to accept that, and I quickly retreated to the bedroom. I needed space. I needed time to think. I needed to be alone. The moment I was in the bedroom, I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow. The tears came without warning, hot and stinging, but I couldn't stop them. I cried for everything I had lost, for the mistakes I had made, for the life I had ruined. And I cried for Ethan, for the connection I couldn't explain, for the pull I couldn't deny. I heard my husband's footsteps down the hall, his voice calling out to me, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't know how to fix this. The house was quiet again, the only sound the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside me raged on, tearing me apart piece by piece. I didn't know where to go from here. I didn't know how to undo what had been done. But I knew one thing for sure, nothing would ever be the same again. The days after that night blurred together in a haze of guilt and confusion. It felt like I was living in a fog, moving through my days with no clear sense of direction, unable to escape the thoughts that clung to me like shadows. Ethan's presence was still felt in every corner of the house, his touch still fresh on my skin, though he hadn't been back since that evening. And with each passing hour, the weight of the secret I was carrying grew heavier. I kept telling myself it was a mistake, just a fleeting moment of weakness that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I couldn't erase the way his eyes had looked at me, the way the world had felt different in that brief, electric moment. I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted inside of me, something that I couldn't control. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The house had become quieter in the days since Ethan had left, the absence of his presence almost deafening. My husband went about his usual routine, his work occupying most of his time, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't bring myself to talk to him about what had happened, couldn't even look him in the eye without feeling the crushing weight of my guilt. How could I tell him the truth? How could I admit to him that I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed? I sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the gray sky. The weather mirrored my mood, overcast, heavy, oppressive. I should have been used to this by now, this emptiness that seemed to pervade every aspect of my life. But this was different. This wasn't just about the silence in my marriage, It was about the darkness that had come with my own desires, desires that I couldn't escape. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see my husband standing in the doorway, his briefcase in hand. He looked tired, but there was a quiet concern in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a while. "Kate," he said, his voice soft, "we need to talk." My heart sank. I had known this conversation was coming. I had been avoiding it for days, but now there was no escaping it. I had to face him. I had to face the truth. I put down my coffee cup and stood up, trying to steady myself. "What about?" I asked, my voice a little too tight. He walked into the room, setting his briefcase down on the counter. "You've been distant," he said, his tone measured. "I can see it. I don't know what's going on, but I can feel it. And I'm worried about you." I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be in the dark about what was going on. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting him. Not when I had already hurt him so much without even meaning to. "I'm just tired," I said, my voice sounding too hollow to be believable. "It's been a lot lately." He shook his head, a small frown appearing on his face. "Kate, that's not it. You're not just tired. I can see something's wrong. I know you're hiding something from me." I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either come crashing down or stay buried forever. I could tell him. I could tell him the truth, and it would destroy everything. Or I could keep pretending, keep lying to him, and live with this weight forever. I swallowed hard, the words choking me. "I'm not hiding anything," I managed to say, but I could hear the lie in my own voice. My husband studied me for a moment, his gaze searching. Then, to my surprise, he sighed and looked away, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I'm just overthinking things," he said quietly. "But I don't know what's going on with you, Kate. And it's scaring me." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time avoiding the truth, avoiding the way I felt, that I hadn't considered how much it was affecting him. He could tell something was wrong, and it was eating away at him. I wasn't the only one who was suffering, but I had been too selfish to see it. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what's wrong with me." He reached out, placing a hand on mine. "You don't have to apologize," he said softly. "I just want to help you. Whatever it is, we'll work through it together." I nodded, but the words felt empty. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that everything could be fixed, but deep down, I knew that the damage had already been done. The truth was out of my hands now. It had already taken root, and there was nothing I could do to change it. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I tried to sleep, but the thoughts kept coming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, heard his voice. I could feel the weight of his touch on my skin, and I couldn't escape it. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I turned over to face my husband, his breathing steady and calm in the darkness. He was asleep, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. And for the first time in a long time, I hated myself. I hated what I had done, hated that I had let myself be drawn into this mess. But I couldn't change it. I couldn't go back. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. My husband had already left for work, his absence a stark reminder of everything I had been avoiding. The silence was overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I wandered through the house, aimlessly, not knowing what to do with myself. I couldn't go on like this, living in this limbo, stuck between the past and the future. I had to make a decision. I had to confront what I had done, whether I was ready for the consequences or not. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I stared at the phone in front of me. I knew what I had to do. I had to call Ethan. I had to face him, face what we had done, and figure out where we went from here. But as my finger hovered over the screen, I froze. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to face the truth. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't ready to lose everything. For now, all I could do was wait. Wait for the moment when I would have to make a choice. And I knew that choice would change everything. The days seemed to drag on, each one blurring into the next, like the dull gray sky that hung heavy outside. My thoughts kept returning to Ethan, and I hated myself for it. I hated the way his presence still lingered in the house, the way his touch felt like it had branded my skin. I couldn't escape it. No matter how much I tried to focus on my husband, on the life I had built, Ethan's face kept slipping into my mind, uninvited, a constant reminder of the mistake I had made. My husband noticed the change, of course. He wasn't blind, and he wasn't oblivious. But he didn't ask questions. He didn't press me for answers. He just went about his day, lost in his work, while I sat in the background, watching him with a sense of guilt that was suffocating. I should have talked to him. I should have confessed everything, faced the consequences of what I had done. But I couldn't. I was terrified of what might happen if I did. Terrified that everything I had known, everything I had built with him, would come crumbling down. The house felt emptier than usual. My husband's absence, the way he threw himself into his work, made it feel like I was living with a stranger. We shared the same space, but we no longer shared anything else. Not our thoughts, not our feelings, not our lives. I had distanced myself from him long before the storm that night, but now, the distance between us felt like an insurmountable chasm. I found myself retreating further into myself, spending more time alone in the house, avoiding the places where my husband and I had once been close. I couldn't bear to look at him, not with the weight of the secret pressing down on me. I couldn't bear to face him when every part of me was screaming for release, for something different, for something that would make me feel alive again. But even in the silence, I couldn't escape my own thoughts. Ethan's presence haunted me, like a ghost that refused to leave. I tried to block him out, but it was no use. His smile, the way he had looked at me that night, everything about it had etched itself into my memory, an indelible mark that I couldn't erase. I thought about him constantly. I wondered what he was doing, if he was thinking about me too, if he felt the same guilt, the same confusion. But I didn't know. I hadn't spoken to him since that night, and part of me was afraid to. Afraid of what I might say, what he might say. Afraid of the consequences that would come with reopening that door. But there were moments when I couldn't stop myself. When I would reach for my phone, my finger hovering over his name, debating whether I should call him, whether I should apologize, whether I should ask him to explain what had happened. But every time, I would pull my hand back, too scared to face whatever lay on the other side of that conversation. It was the middle of the afternoon when I finally gave in. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, its screen dark, mocking me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to hear his voice. I picked up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers shook as I scrolled through my contacts, finally landing on Ethan's name. I stared at it for a long moment, almost willing it to disappear, to make the decision for me. But it didn't. It stayed there, waiting. So, I pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I felt the tension in my chest tighten with each ring. What was I doing? Why was I doing this? But I didn't have time to second-guess myself. I had already crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Hello? His voice, soft but unmistakable, crackled through the phone. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Ethan? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. It's Kate. There was a pause, a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Kate, he finally replied, his voice low, almost hesitant. What's going on? I haven't heard from you in days. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. He hadn't heard from me because I had been avoiding him. Because I couldn't bring myself to face him, to face what had happened between us. I don't know what to say, I said, my voice shaking. I've been trying to make sense of everything. You don't have to explain yourself, Kate, he said, his voice softer now, understanding. I know it was a mistake. We both know that. I flinched at his words. A mistake. That's all it was. That's all it could ever be. It wasn't just a mistake, I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't just a mistake. I can't stop thinking about it. About you. Another silence stretched between us, and I could hear his breath on the other end, steady and calm. But I knew he was feeling the same thing I was, this strange, undeniable pull, this attraction that neither of us had asked for, but that we couldn't escape. I'm sorry, Kate, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted to make you feel this way. I never wanted to complicate things. I closed my eyes again, feeling the tears welling up behind my eyelids. I don't know what to do, I said, the words coming out in a broken sob. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I even want to fix it. There was a long pause before Ethan spoke again. I don't want you to be confused, Kate, he said softly. But I don't want to be the one who makes you feel like this either. If you need space, I'll give it to you. But I can't pretend that nothing happened. I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you. I took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over me. I don't know what I feel anymore, I said quietly, the tears spilling down my cheeks. But I know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep hiding from the truth. His voice softened again. Then let's figure it out together. But I knew it wasn't that simple. We had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. I wasn't sure where this path would lead, or if it was a path I even wanted to follow. But one thing was clear, the truth had been spoken, and it was out there now, for both of us to face. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I knew that the consequences of our actions would follow us, whether we liked it or not. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had just agreed to, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. The days that followed the phone call felt like they passed in slow motion, each minute stretching into eternity. I had spoken to Ethan, but I hadn't really said anything. The conversation had been an attempt to make sense of something that couldn't be made sense of. I had told him I was confused, that I didn't know what I wanted, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The truth was, I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to push away the feelings I had for him, no matter how wrong they were. When my husband came home that evening, he was his usual self, tired, distracted, but still somehow present. We ate dinner in silence, the hum of the refrigerator in the background the only sound in the room. It was strange, how easily I had fallen back into this routine, as though nothing had happened, as though everything were fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living a lie, that I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. I tried to focus on the mundane, how his day had gone, how the weather had been, small talk that meant nothing but filled the silence. He didn't seem to notice the tension between us, but I felt it like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man I had married, but I also saw the man I had grown apart from, the man who had become a stranger to me. The more I tried to focus on him, the more my mind drifted back to Ethan. I couldn't help it. I was consumed by it. I had always told myself that I would never let anything come between my family, but now, here I was, standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo. I had made a choice, and now I had to live with it. I didn't know what Ethan had felt about that kiss. He hadn't said much during our phone conversation. He had agreed to give me space, but I knew that wasn't enough. We couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. And I couldn't pretend that everything was normal anymore. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't aching inside, torn between two worlds, two lives, two versions of myself that I didn't know how to reconcile. The next few days passed in a blur, each one feeling like it was dragging me further into the depths of my own confusion. I went through the motions, but nothing felt real. I would wake up, get dressed, make breakfast, talk to my husband, but it was all mechanical, like I was going through a checklist of things to do. I wasn't really there. My mind was somewhere else, trapped in a storm of emotions I couldn't escape. One afternoon, I found myself walking through the house aimlessly when I caught sight of the phone again. I hadn't spoken to Ethan since our last conversation, and every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't know how to face him. I had crossed a line, and I didn't know how to go back. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over his name in the contact list. I didn't know why I was doing this, why I couldn't stop myself. But I couldn't help it. I had to know what he was thinking. I had to know if he felt the same way. Before I could think too much about it, I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice, warm and familiar, cracked through the silence, and I immediately felt a rush of emotion. "Kate," he said softly, as if he had been waiting for this call, too. "Are you okay?" I didn't know how to answer him. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I'm not sure what I want anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know either," he replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I've been thinking about you. About us." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle into my chest. "I can't stop thinking about you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop feeling this way." "Kate," he said, his voice serious now, "we can't keep doing this. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt anyone. But I can't ignore what's happening between us." I knew what he was saying. He was trying to be the voice of reason, trying to stop something that both of us knew was wrong. But I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear that we couldn't be together. I didn't want to hear that this thing between us was over before it had even begun. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything," he said softly. "You just need to figure out what you want. What's right for you." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that I knew what I wanted, that I couldn't ignore this feeling, this pull toward him. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to admit it out loud. Because doing so would mean that I would have to face the consequences. I would have to confront the reality of what we had done, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I stayed silent for a long time, the weight of the moment hanging heavily between us. The longer I waited, the harder it became to speak, to make any sense of the mess I had created. The storm inside me had been raging for so long, and now it felt like I was standing in the eye of it, unsure of what would come next. "I'm sorry," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." He didn't say anything for a moment, and I wondered if he had hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice soft, understanding. "I'm not sorry," he said. "But I think we need to figure this out. Together." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it was even possible. But for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could figure this out. Maybe we could find a way to move forward. Maybe. But then again, maybe we couldn't. Maybe everything was too broken, too far gone to fix. I didn't know. But I did know one thing, the storm inside me hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. I hung up the phone, the silence around me swallowing me whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a decision that would change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for that change. The days after my phone call with Ethan were nothing short of agonizing. Each moment felt like an eternity, and yet, time moved forward without any regard for the turmoil I was trapped in. I had opened a door, one that led into a space I couldn't fully comprehend, and now I had no idea how to navigate it. The guilt was suffocating, and with each passing hour, the reality of what had happened settled deeper into my bones. I couldn't go back. I couldn't undo the choices I had made, but the weight of them, of everything, was unbearable. When my husband was around, I put on a mask. I smiled, I played the role of the dutiful wife, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was that everything was broken, and I didn't know how to fix it. I felt like I was living two separate lives, one with my husband, the other with the unspoken connection that had formed with Ethan. Neither world felt real anymore, and both were pulling me in different directions. I hadn't spoken to Ethan since the call. I had made the decision to distance myself, to avoid any further contact, but it was harder than I had anticipated. Every time I picked up my phone, I felt a strange compulsion to reach out to him. I wanted to hear his voice, to know that he was okay, but I also feared what would happen if I gave in. If I allowed myself to slip further into this mess, what would become of me? What would become of my family? The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up, lying next to my husband, and feel nothing. The warmth of his body beside me felt hollow, a reminder of the gap between us, the gap I had created without realizing it. I could feel him breathing next to me, but it was as though we were living in parallel worlds, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, unable to bridge the distance between us. One morning, I woke up early, the light just beginning to filter through the curtains. My husband was still asleep, his arm draped over the pillow beside me. I watched him for a moment, the steady rise and fall of his chest a rhythmic reminder of the life we had once shared. And yet, there was a nagging feeling deep inside me, one that I couldn't shake. I had betrayed him, and in doing so, I had betrayed myself. I had crossed a line I never should have crossed, and now I didn't know how to find my way back. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb him, and went into the kitchen. The house was still, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring out the window. The world outside seemed so calm, so distant from the chaos inside me. I couldn't help but think about Ethan, about the connection we had shared, about the things that had been left unsaid. I missed him in ways that were both painful and confusing. How had we gotten to this point? How had I let it all spiral out of control? The phone sat on the table in front of me, its screen glowing faintly. I had promised myself I wouldn't reach out to Ethan again, but the temptation was overwhelming. I could feel the pull, the desire to hear his voice, to understand what he was feeling. But as my finger hovered over his name in my contacts, I hesitated. What would I even say? How could I possibly explain everything that had happened? How could I even begin to make sense of it? I sighed, dropping my hand to my lap. I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep living in this space of uncertainty, of indecision. I needed to make a choice, to confront the reality of what I had done. But I didn't know if I was strong enough to face the consequences. I took a deep breath and pushed the phone away from me, determined not to reach for it again. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had to figure out what I wanted, what was best for me. But as I sat there, the silence of the house pressing in on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to lose everything. The door to the kitchen opened, and I turned to see my husband standing in the doorway. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he walked over to the counter and grabbed a cup of coffee for himself. He didn't say anything, just stood there, drinking his coffee in silence. I couldn't read him. I didn't know what was going on in his mind. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't the same as before. Something had changed between us, something I couldn't undo. "Kate," he said after a long silence, his voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." I froze, my heart sinking. I had been dreading this moment. I had known it was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready to face the truth, to admit everything I had done. But there was no escaping it now. I stood up, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He put his cup down on the counter and turned to face me. "You've been distant," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know what's going on with you, Kate. But I can feel it. I know something's wrong." I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I wanted to tell him the truth, wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. I was too afraid. Too afraid of what it would mean for us, for our marriage. If I told him, it would destroy everything. And yet, if I didn't tell him, I would be living in a lie, and I couldn't keep doing that either. "I've just been confused," I said finally, my voice shaky. "There's been a lot going on in my head, and I don't know how to deal with it." He didn't look satisfied with my answer, but he didn't press me further. He just nodded, as though he understood. But I knew better. I knew he didn't understand. How could he? I hadn't even begun to understand it myself. "Kate," he said after a long pause, "I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm here. I'm still here. I just want to help." I nodded, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything could be fixed, that we could go back to the way things were before all of this. But I knew deep down that was impossible. The damage had been done. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence. We barely spoke, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. I could feel the walls closing in, the space between us growing wider with every passing moment. I went to bed that night, lying next to my husband, but I couldn't sleep. I could feel his warmth beside me, but it didn't comfort me. I felt more alone than ever before. The storm inside me was far from over. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew that it would only continue to grow until I faced it. The next morning, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, and for a brief moment, I thought about not answering. But something made me pick it up. "Kate," Ethan's voice came through, calm but distant. "We need to talk." And just like that, I knew that everything was about to change once again. The phone call from Ethan had shaken me more than I was willing to admit. The simple words "we need to talk" hung in the air between us like a warning, like an inevitable consequence of everything that had been left unsaid for so long. My finger hovered over the phone for several moments after the call ended, unsure of whether I should call him back or leave it at that. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to face the reality of what we had done, of what I had done. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. My husband was in the other room, unaware of the storm brewing inside me, the guilt and confusion that had been growing ever since that night. The night when everything had changed. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between my responsibilities and my own desires, between the life I had and the one that had been set into motion without my consent. But what was I supposed to say to Ethan? How could I explain what had happened between us, what it meant, what it could mean? There was so much uncertainty, so many unknowns. I couldn't promise him anything, couldn't promise myself anything. Everything had become too complicated, too blurred. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the world that seemed so far away, so disconnected from the chaos that was unfolding inside me. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a crisp, cool air. The world outside felt calm, untouched by the turmoil that was consuming me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say to Ethan, or how to face the consequences of my actions. I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to reach out to him, to hear his voice, to see where this would go. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't let myself fall any further into this. The line had already been crossed, and the more I tried to deny it, the more it felt like it was pulling me in. I took a deep breath and dialed Ethan's number, the familiar ring on the other end sending a shiver down my spine. Each ring felt like a countdown to something I couldn't control, a moment that would change everything. When he answered, his voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Kate," he said softly, "I'm glad you called." I didn't know what to say, I confessed, my voice shaking. I didn't know how to handle this, how to fix it. "You don't have to fix anything," he replied, his tone soothing but firm. "We just need to talk. We need to figure out where we go from here." I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, the words he spoke hanging in the air like an invitation, but one I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. Where did we go from here? What was I supposed to do with this? With him? "I don't even know what I want," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I can't think straight." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Ethan said. "But we can't just keep pretending nothing happened. We both know it did. And now, we need to figure out how we move forward." I wanted to say something, to tell him I was scared, that I was terrified of what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? How could I explain the mess I had created, the mess I was drowning in? "I don't know what's right," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. For anything." There was a long pause, and then he spoke again, his voice softer, almost a whisper. "I know, Kate. But we can't avoid it forever. We have to face it." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared of losing everything." "You're not going to lose everything," he reassured me, his voice steady. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." But I wasn't so sure. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The more I listened to him, the more I felt like I was losing myself, like I was being pulled in a direction I couldn't control. And the more I thought about my husband, the more the guilt became unbearable. "I have to go," I said suddenly, cutting the conversation short. "I need to think about this. I can't keep doing this." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't want to hear what he had to say. I didn't want to face the reality of what had just happened. I needed to escape, even if just for a moment. I needed time to think, to figure out what I wanted, what I really wanted. I walked through the house aimlessly, as if moving through a dream, a nightmare, I wasn't sure which. The walls seemed to close in on me as I passed room after room, each one holding a memory, a piece of the life I had built, a life that was now slipping through my fingers. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about what he meant to me, about what I had allowed to happen. But I couldn't stop thinking about my husband, either. I couldn't ignore the life we had, the vows we had made. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make the feelings go away. They were there, always present, always pulling at me, a constant reminder of what I had done. I couldn't escape them, no matter how much I wished I could. I stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street, the world outside seemingly unaffected by the storm that had torn through my life. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed time. I needed to figure out what I was going to do, what I was going to say, if anything. But deep down, I knew that the longer I waited, the harder it would be. I had already crossed a line, and now, there was no turning back. I glanced at the phone again. Ethan's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, I thought about answering. I thought about picking up and continuing the conversation, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to find my way out of this darkness. I had to find a way to fix this before it consumed me completely. But for now, all I could do was wait. And wait.